So today we are going to take a look at Drive by Daniel Pink, and Drive is all about motivation. Um, Daniel Pink talks about how motivation has shifted, or at least our understanding of motivation has shifted a lot in the past 100 years. But first, he talks about like a primitive type of motivation, which he characterizes as motivation 1.0. And this type of motivation, you're motivated for shelter, food, just very basic sorts of animal things. And then he talks about how there was a management revolution sometime in between the 50s or the 40s and the 70s, somewhere around there, where they decided that it's all about carrots and sticks. And so it's all about punishing bad behavior and rewarding good behavior, and that's how you get good employees. The lens of the book tends to be more oriented towards business, and so a lot of it talks about management style. But he talks about how now we're moving into a third phase of understanding, but also the way our economy is shifting is also requiring this third stage understanding of motivation 3.0. And what they found is using a lot of carrots and sticks, so punishments and rewards, to get people to engage in behavior. What it does is it makes the motivation extrinsic rather than intrinsic. And for a lot of creative tasks, you actually need to be intrinsically motivated, or you do better when you're intrinsically motivated. And so what it effectively does is the carrots and sticks demotivate for creative tasks. And the problem, as Daniel Pink characterizes, is that a lot of tasks in modern times require creativity and dynamic thinking. They're not as... When you're just doing the same task over and over and over, like working on an assembly line, carrots and sticks work really well. But when you need to do a dynamic task that involves you thinking critically, interacting with others, coming up with new ideas, carrots and sticks don't work very well. In terms of what they'll do is they'll teach you to be extrinsically motivated. And so one example he uses in the book's full of examples, is if you pay your kid to take out the trash, what you'll teach them is taking out the trash is not a worthwhile task to do on their own. And so you'll teach them that this is a type of task that you need to be paid in order to do. It's not a fun task. And so you teach them to dislike the task for intrinsic reasons. And pretty soon you'll need to pay them in order to get them to take out the trash. They won't do it without getting paid. And further still, you'll need to pay them more at a certain point. Otherwise they won't want to do it. And so this is fairly interesting. I've been thinking about this sort of idea a lot in terms of education, how in effect you want the kids to be, or even adults in the case of college, you want them to be dynamic thinkers, but what you're really doing is your grades are a form of carrots and sticks, basically. Having a bad grade obviously gets you in trouble with your parents, but the grades are emphasized more than the learning. At college, like, the number one question students ask was, is this going to be on the test? Not something like, how important is this for understanding, like, other material, which is a more important question, perhaps, if your goal is learning. But the goal is just the carrots and sticks, and I think a lot of kids are demotivated towards learning as a consequence of this motivational system, perhaps, which, as Daniel Pink notes, carrots and sticks are really good in the short term, but long term, they're not very effective. And so when your goal is to do well on standardized tests for that year, carrots and sticks might work really well. But if you're trying to produce effective members of society, perhaps it's not the way to go. Anyways, he also creates another model, I think this was his, of type X personalities, people who are motivated really well by extrinsic rewards, and type I personalities, which are motivated by intrinsic rewards. He has about, I think, a chapter on that. And then he talks about the three overarching ideas for effectively motivating people who are type I, or to put it in another way, for motivation 3.0, this is how you should motivate people, not using carrots and sticks. Instead, what you need to do is you need to, 1, give them autonomy, 2, emphasize mastery or the pursuit of skill. That's an important. You want them to be trying to get better at whatever they're doing for just the purpose of being better at it. And 3 is a sense of purpose. And he goes into details. He has a chapter on each one of these. So let's get into the ratings a little bit. For utility, I gave it a 6.5. I think that this is pretty useful for thinking about motivation. It's also very, very short. But I'm not sure why I didn't score this higher, actually, now that I think about it. Because the book is very easy to read. And I think understanding motivation a little bit better can be useful. I think that the reason I didn't score it higher is because almost all the examples, I think, tend to lean towards business and motivating people in the context of a business setting. And that's perhaps not, in terms of examples, they're maybe not that useful because a lot of people aren't managers. And so it's perhaps not the most practical demonstration. Although in the back, he does have a rather large appendix, which I have mixed feelings on, because a huge portion of the book is an appendix where he gives various resources and talks about other books that are relevant. My perception was, I actually really liked the appendix, but I also felt to some degree it was in there to get up to a certain page count, like nonfiction interesty book page count standard is like 240 plus, and he would have been like 160 without it. And so in a sense, I think it was perhaps fluffed up a little, but okay, what are you gonna do? For entertainment, I gave it a 5. It's interesting going. Perhaps I scored him a little lower on this than he deserves. We'll get to that in a second. For interest, I gave it a 7. I think that as a motivation is relevant for everyone, as far as I can tell. And the notion that rewards can sometimes demotivate people is very interesting. It's also a bit of a novel idea, although I've seen it a lot in nonfiction books, and so it's novel, but it's not uncommon. You can find this idea elsewhere. For style, I gave it a 4, and I had a hard time putting my finger on. I made a post on Instagram about this book, and I was having a hard time putting my finger on what about his style bothered me, because the writing seems okay and the organization of stuff seems okay, and then I realized it kind of feels like his style, or perhaps the organization, is a little Frankenstein-y, where he's pulling together a whole bunch of different sources, and it almost feels like a collection of essays in a way, rather than a more cohesive book. This is actually something I'm fairly concerned that I might be doing in my writing, and so it feels a little weird to call someone out, and maybe I'm just projecting. I read another one of his books, and I had like the same thing, where my feeling was like he was relaying ideas, and he was perhaps didn't understand the ideas as well as I might have liked myself, and so they came off in a way that was perhaps characterized another way. His other book I also thought just had some points that were wrong, but it was overall interesting. I forget the name of it. It was about right brain, left brain thinking. Anyways, for readability, I gave it an 8.5. I think it's, as far as giving these ideas up in a very easy to digest way. I think he does a really good job. I have mixed feelings on the appendix at the end. I actually really like it, but I think that the reason it's there is to fluff up the book, which is mildly annoying. But I love stuff like that at the end, like additional resources, tools, that sort of stuff, because they tend to be more utility dense than the rest of the book, and perhaps less entertaining. But I'd rather have utility density because they cut straight to the point. For difficulty, I give it a 7.5. Fairly easy. And then overall, gave it a 6.43. I think it's pretty solid. I think that as far as recommendations go, this book if it's a nice niche sort of thing where the books that are very short and I think relatively information dense are books I like a lot in some ways, or books that are easy to get through, because when someone doesn't read a lot and they come to me for a book recommendation, I almost always want to recommend something that I think they can get through, because I think completing a book is a good way to establish momentum, as well as it makes you feel good, especially if you haven't completed a book since you got out of school, or you've not completed a nonfiction book like ever, which some people have never done outside of like school context. And so I think that the experience of getting something useful and also getting to completion is a pretty good look. And so I would rather recommend something like Drive, which it was quite succinct and actually has some interesting ideas and I think useful ideas in terms of thinking about motivation. I would be more apt to recommend that than a book that I like more that is a lot longer, such as Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which I think is a more solid book. But I would, if someone doesn't read a lot, I'm not going to recommend the 450-page book or however long that is. I'd rather recommend something like Drive, which I think is a little over 200 pages, but like only 150 of it is book and the rest is appendices or stuff kind of tangentially related to the book, but it's not really book. And so I think that I'll actually recommend this book quite a bit, despite me having some reservations about his writing style, as well as some problems with his other book. Anyways, as far as discussion goes, if you could think of one task that you enjoyed doing, and then someone started to give you some sort of reward for doing it, and then you started hating it or disliking it, that would be interesting to hear about. All right, have a good one.